Good evening, all. Welcome to tonight's shir, which is quite an ambitious topic. We've got a lot to cover, so we will get underway. So every year has its Kiddush, every year has its uniqueness. And of course, this year, Purim falls out on Friday, which is quite a rare occurrence. And when Purim falls out on Friday, so in Eretz Yisrael, in the walled cities such as Yerushalayim, they have their own halachos, which govern how the mitzvahs are done over there, giving rise to the Purim Mushulash, where the mitzvahs are spread out over the 3 days of Purim, which we've discussed at a previous year. Not much of that is really Nogeya to us in Chutz La'aretz. What is Nogeya to us in Chutz La'aretz, the only real change in halacha when Purim falls out on a Friday is the timing of the Purim Seuda, when we make the Purim meal. The Purim Seuda is one of the 4 mitzvahs of Purim that we have to have a festive meal. And how exactly that's celebrated, there are other halachos. The Rambam says one should have meat, we light candles, etc. And that, like all the other mitzvahs of Purim, must be observed during the daytime. If a person has a Purim Seuda at night, they are not yotze, they have not fulfilled the mitzvah. The mitzvah must be done during the daytime. And technically, as we will see, that mitzvah goes throughout the entire day. One can fulfill the mitzvah in the morning, have a Purim Seuda for breakfast. One may choose to have a Purim Seuda at lunchtime. One could have a Purim Seuda later in the day, which is generally the accepted practice. The widespread practice is we start the Purim Seuda later in the day, with the majority of the Seuda starting in the daytime and then continuing into the night. But of course, this year, which is Erev Shabbos, so there are different halachos with regards to the timing of the Seuda, as we're going to see, and that raises the topic of tonight, and that is Pores Mapah Umekadesh, which is not unique to Purim going into Shabbos. It's something that one may do on any Erev Shabbos going into Shabbos, and that is the possibility of starting a meal on Friday afternoon, and continuing that meal into Shabbos itself with making Kiddush in the middle. That for some families, perhaps for Purim, is a little bit more convenient to do. Certainly when you talk about communities where people are working on Friday because it's a work day, and they're going to make the Purim Seuda a little bit later. So we're going to be looking tonight at the background to Pores Mapah Umekadesh from the Gemara and in the Halachos, the way they are discussed in the Shulchan Aruch and in the Achronim. We are going to look in general at the attitude of the Rabbeim, of the Chabad Rebbes from previous generations and in our generation on the issue of being Pores Mapah Umekadesh. We will look practically at how it's done for those who do it, and then we will look at the application for Purim as well. So I'll bring up some sources on the screen. Please feel free to share, to look inside. Otherwise, everything will be explained. The sources are in Hebrew, but everything will be explained as we go. So let's start off with the Ramah. The Ramah, Rav Moshe Isserles, in his glosses on the Shulchan Aruch in the laws of Purim, in Siman Taf Reish Tzadik Hey Sif Beis, the Ramah says as follows: the custom is to make the Purim Seuda after Mincha. The Arvis Yispalo Balayla, and Ma'ariv will be davened at night, which is interesting because at the Purim Seuda earlier in this Sif in the Shulchan Aruch, the Mechaber says that there's a mitzvah Chayv Inish Lebsume Bepuri, a person must become intoxicated on Purim. And all of the commentaries tell us that one must be wary that they still have the presence of mind to be able to daven Ma'ariv at night. And indeed, the Ramah himself would walk around the town of Krakow at night after the Purim Seuda, knocking on people's doors to remind them to daven Ma'ariv. So Mincha is davened earlier. This is on a normal Purim. And the majority of the Seuda must be during the daytime. It's okay if it continues into the night, which is technically after Purim is over, but the majority of the meal should be during the daytime. Unlike those who start their Seudas Purim late afternoon towards evening, and then their main Seuda is not on the 14th of Adar, which is Purim, but rather on the 15th. So that is in a regular year. That's generally what is done. Says the Ramah. When Purim falls on a Friday, as it does this year, Yasu Hasuda B'Shachris, the Seuda should be made in the morning, Mishum Kavod Shabbos, because of the honor of Shabbos. Umisha Roitzel Asois Tamid, someone who wants to always make in any year, make the Purim Seuda B'Shachris, Harishus B'Yodin, they may do so. So this is the halachic change, that on Erev Shabbos, the Purim Seuda says that Ramah should be B'Shachris because of Kavod Shabbos. Now, what is the Kavod Shabbos that he is referring to? It's not just the practicalities, the one has to cook and make sure that they're ready for Shabbos, because that could be done on Thursday night. Rather, it is referring to a halacha which is discussed in the laws of Shabbos in Siman Reish Mem Tes, which are the laws of Erev Shabbos. The Shulchan Aruch here we have from the Alter Rebbe's Shulchan Aruch says that a person is not allowed to eat a meal, a large meal, a Seuda Kavua on Erev Shabbos. Why? Because it is a mitzvah to enter into Shabbos with an appetite, that he has an appetite to eat the Shabbos meal. There's a mitzvah of Oineg Shabbos, to delight in Shabbos, and that is by eating and drinking. And a person should not come into Shabbos so stuffed that they're not really interested in the Shabbos meal. And for that reason, there is a mitzvah not to make a Seuda on Erev Shabbos, because one will get caught up. And that's talking generally about a Seudas Rishus. But the Alter Rebbe says as follows. Mikom Mokem mitzvah lahasru asuda lechatchila koidim shah asiris. Sharim mishah asiris ve'elach mitzvah limenea milikvoya afilu Seuda ktana sheraga babachol imi Seudas harishus kamoishi yisbar. That one is allowed to make a Seudas mitzvah on Erev Shabbos if that is the day. So, for example, a bris that falls out on a Friday, or a pidyon aben that falls out on Friday, or in this case, Purim. The Seudas Purim is a mitzvah. If it falls out on Friday, one is allowed to make that Seuda. But lechatchila, says the Alter Rebbe, that one should start that Seuda before the Shah Asiris, the 10th halachic hour of the day, which is calculated by taking sunrise to sunset, dividing into 12 equal parts. In the summer, that will be slightly longer than 60 minutes. In the winter, it would be less than 60 minutes. And we count 9 hours. And at the end of that 9th hour, that is from that time on, it's a mitzvah not to have a Seuda on Erev Shabbos, even to start a Seuda, which would be a Seudas mitzvah. Imkain gamba Seudas mitzvah, kiven she'efshar lakdima, because it's possible to start the meal earlier. Koidem sha'asiris, yesh lo lakdima lechatchila, one should do the meal earlier lechatchila. And this is the basis for the Ramah's ruling in the laws of Purim, that because one must enter into Shabbos with an appetite because of Kavod Shabbos, therefore one must make the Seuda earlier. Now, if you notice, the Alter Rebbe over here writes, based on the Shulchan Aruch and the laws of Shabbos, that means before the Shah Asiris, which is actually quite late in the day. Here it's probably after 4 o'clock, probably 5 o'clock or so in the afternoon. Yet in the laws of the Seudas Purim, the Ramah writes to make it Shacharis, to make the Seuda B'Shachris, to make it in the morning. And on this, the Mishnah Brura observes that what does it mean to make the Seuda in the morning? HaSeuda B'Shachris, Hainu, he says, Koidem Chatzois Hayoim Lechatchila, that it should be done Lechatchila before midday, because Shachris, the morning, means before midday. And have a look what the Maril writes, who takes a slightly different view. So the Mishnah Brura, as does the Aruch HaShulchan, says that the Seuda on Erev Purim should be before Chatzois. You should start before Chatzois. Now that's Lechatchila. But if one did not do so, they could start the meal even afterwards. However, in that case, they should eat less than usual so that they are not overly full by the time Shabbos comes in. Now, what does the Maharil say? The Maharil says, not like the Mishnah Brura, not like the Ramah who writes, make the Seuda B'Shachris before midday. He writes, like the Shulchan Aruch in the laws of Shabbos, that one must make the meal before the 10th hour of the day. As we saw, the Alter Rebbe writes as well. And therefore, according to that view of the Maharil, there is no requirement, there's no hidur to make the Seuda before Shachris. As long as you start before, you make the meal before the Shah Asiris, you are okay. And there's a discussion, does that mean to begin, or does that mean to finish the meal by that time? But according to him, you're good to go as long as you do the meal, you have the meal before the 10th hour. Now, but if one did not do so, so for example, you're busy with Mitzrayim, you're running around learning the Megillah all day for people, and it comes late in the afternoon and you didn't get to start before Chatzois, you didn't get to start before the Shah Asiris, so then you're allowed to make the Seuda even later in the day, if that's the only way that is possible. So just interesting, if the halach in the laws of Shabbos is that on Erev Shabbos you're allowed to have a Seuda before the 10th hour, why does the Ramah here write that one must make the Purim Seuda B'Shachris? So there's an interesting Ktsois HaShulchan of Avram Chaim Noah, who was a Lubavitch Posek in Eretz Yisrael, and he writes that Erev Purim is a little bit different from other obligations, from other types of Seudas. And the reason is because at a regular Seuda, whilst people may say L'chaim, but on Erev Purim, as this halacha says, there is a mitzvah L'besume Purim to become intoxicated on Purim. And since when a person's intoxicated, it takes a while for them to recuperate. Therefore, the Ramah says on Erev Purim, the Seuda should be done b'shachris, or as the Mishnah Berurah says, before Chatzos, before midday, because Shichrus is Metzuya, because it's commonplace that people get drunk, and therefore they need more time to be able to recuperate and be ready to enter into Shabbos in a way that they can have proper covered Shabbos to enjoy Shabbos and enjoy the Sudas Shabbos. So that is all lechatchila. That's how it should be done. As we said, the di'evet, if one missed those deadlines of either midday or the 10th hour, they may make the Suda later in the day. And then there are two possibilities. One possibility is you make the Suda later in the day, like we used to do in yeshiva. If it's 6 o'clock that you start, you wash, you make your Suda, eat a little bit of bread, have a little bit of meat, drink some wine or some l'chaim, and then you bench. Before Shabbos comes in, you bench, and your Shabbos, you've ended your Purim Seuda. Then you'll go as usual, go to shul, daven Ma'ariv, Kabbalah Shabbos, and then come home and have the regular Sudas Shabbos. So that's one way to go about it. There's another way to do it, and that is the topic discussed tonight, and that is being Pores Mapah Umekadesh, that instead of having to stop one's meal on Erev Shabbos and bench and then go to shul and daven, one can start their Sudas Purim on Erev Shabbos, may continue going into Shabbos without having to stop for davening, and there's the possibility of then continuing into the night as well. So, the topic of Pores Mapah Umekadesh in Halachos starts with the Gemara in Psachim. The Gemara in Psachim brings a machlokes between the two Tanaim, Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Yossi, that if a person is sitting on Erev Shabbos, they're making a meal on Erev Shabbos, they're sitting down together with some friends, they're eating a meal, and it comes the time Shabbos comes in, it comes Shkia, it comes sunset. What do you do at the point? So the machlokes is, do you need to stop the meal or not? So Rabbi Yossi says you do not need to stop. Rabbi Yossi says you can keep going as long as you started your meal beheter at a time which was permissible. You're allowed to keep going. You're allowed to have your meal. And whenever you will finish that meal at night, then you will bench, and then you will daven Ma'ariv, then you will make Kiddush. And according to Rabbi Yossi, you don't need to then have a separate Shabbos meal because that meal of the weekday continued into Shabbos. So Rabbi Yossi's view is ein mafsikin, you do not need to interrupt your meal that you started on Friday. No Kiddush, nothing. You just keep going with your meal. Rabbi Yehuda, however, says mafsikin, that if you're eating a meal on Erev Shabbos and it comes to Shkia, it comes to sunset, you must end your meal, which means to bench and conclude the meal so you can then go and daven Ma'ariv, Kabbalah Shabbos, make Kiddush, and then have a proper Shabbos meal. Says the Gemara, Amar Rabbi Yehuda, Amar Shmuel. Rabbi Yehuda said in the name of Shmuel, who was a first generation Amira in Bavel, Ein halacha like Rabbi Yehuda like Rabbi Yossi. The halacha is neither like Rabbi Yehuda, who says that you stop your meal when Shabbos comes in, and the halacha is not like Rabbi Yossi, who says you can keep going with your meal when Shabbos comes in. Ela Pores Mapah Umekadesh. Rather, what do you do at the point when Shabbos comes in? Pores Mapah, you spread the tablecloth, Umekadesh, and say Kiddush. So what does that mean? So we look at the commentary. We'll skip the. He says like this. Rashi says, "Ein halacha Rabbi Yehuda the Amar mafsikin." Rabbi Yehuda says you must stop your meal, which means akiras shulchan. In the times of the Gemara, the way they used to eat is that each person would have a small portable table that would be brought to them at the start of the meal. And when they would finish the meal, what designated the end of the meal is that table would be removed. Akiras HaShulchan. Nowadays, we don't remove our tables. What it means is to bench and formally conclude that meal. But like Rabbi Yossi, and this, the halacha is not like Rabbi Yossi who says, Ein mafsikin klal, you don't have to stop at all. Rather, Pores Mapah ala shulchan umekadesh hayoim v'choyze v'oichel. You spread a tablecloth over the table, meaning covering the food that's on the table. You say Kiddush, and then you can continue to eat. In this, we have a little bit more detail in the Rashbam. The Rashbam has a question. We know that Shmuel is an Amoira. Both Rabbi Yossi and Rabbi Yehuda are Tanoim. And we have a klal that an Amoira is not able to argue with the rulings of the Tanoim or be mechadish a ruling that is not found in the rulings of the Tanoim. So if Rabbi Yehuda says you have to stop, you have to bench when Shabbos comes in, Rabbi Yossi says you don't have to do anything, no Kiddush, no Mapa, no nothing. How can Shmuel come along and say the halacha is not like Rabbi Yehuda and not like Rabbi Yossi, and you are Pores Mapah Umekadesh? So he says as follows, the Rashbam. The halacha is not like Rabbi Yossi, who says you don't have to stop at all. Rather, what do you do? Rabbi Yossi says you keep going with your meal, even when it's dark, and you bench, and then you bring a cup of wine, you say Kiddush on it, and that's it. Rather, what you do, Pores Mapah Umekadesh, the idea of being Pores Mapah, he explains, is really like we do every Shabbos, where we cover the two Halachos. The reason we cover the two Halachos, there are a number of reasons which are given for it, but one of the reasons is that when we then uncover the Halachos which are on the table, it is as if to show that it is now coming in honor of Shabbos. We've made Kiddush, we've declared the day, we've brought in Shabbos. We then uncover the Halachos to show that this meal is now coming l'kavod Shabbos. And so too, the idea of Pores Mapah Umekadesh is that the food is covered. When you make Kiddush and bring in Shabbos, you then uncover the food in order to show that it is now coming for Shabbos. And the Rashbam asks that question, that he says like this: really, Shmuel holds like Rabbi Yossi, that really technically one does not need to stop their meal. One could keep going with their meal into the night as well. However, since it is possible, and even Rabbi Yossi would agree, that one is allowed to pause in the middle of the meal and make Kiddush, therefore, even Rabbi Yossi would suggest that that is the better thing to do. And why is that? We have a concept, Ein Kiddush ela b'Purim Seuda, that to be Yotze Kiddush, Kiddush must be said at the place where one has a meal. One has to have a Seuda that accompanies Kiddush. So if a person says Kiddush, drinks a little bit of the wine and does not eat anything afterwards, they are not Yotze. One must either have a kazais of hamoitzi, a kazais of mazonis, or another revius of wine. So normally, the Kiddush b'Purim Seuda is that one makes Kiddush, and the Seuda must come after the Kiddush. According to Rabbi Yossi's view, that you would keep going with your weekday meal into Shabbos, and whenever you finish, you then make Kiddush. Then the meal that went into Shabbos becomes your Shabbos meal. But the Shabbos meal, the Purim Seuda, comes before the Kiddush, and therefore it's not ideal. And even Rabbi Yossi would agree that it's better to pause, make Kiddush, and then continue on with the rest of the meal. Tosfos gives a different answer to the question, and he says that no, it's possible that Shmuel does not rule like Rabbi Yossi or like Rabbi Yehuda. Rather, he's ruling like a third opinion, which is found in a brisa which is brought in the Yerushalmi. In Yerushalmi, it says that the Chachamim, whilst Rabbi Yehuda says that you have to stop your meal, Rabbi Yossi says you don't have to stop your meal. But the Chachamim say you have to spread the tablecloth and be Mekadesh, you have to sanctify the day. And therefore, Shmuel's ruling is in accordance with a group of Tanoim identified as the Chachamim. Either way, the Gemara concludes that the halacha is like Shmuel, that Pores Mapah Umekadesh. We do not need to stop our meal and bench that you started on Friday afternoon. You are not allowed to keep going with your meal without making Kiddush and just keep eating and make Kiddush at the end. Instead, the halacha is like Shmuel. The one is Pores Mapah Umekadesh. One pauses their meal, covers the food on the table, makes Kiddush, and then takes off the covering and continues with their meal. That is the halacha which is brought in Shulchan Aruch, in Siman Reish Ayin Aleph, and the halachos there are discussed. So just to run through some of these halachos just outside, because to do it inside will become a little bit more intense. But basically, that's the idea. The halacha is that you're Pores Mapah Umekadesh. And now the question is, how do you go about doing it? Meaning, what exactly do you do? What happens in terms of Kiddush? What happens in terms of Shalom Aleichem, Neishes Chayil? What happens in terms of Hamoitzi? What happens when you bench? The meal that you had on the weekday, and you're now going into Shabbos, you say Ritzei. But in this case, when Erev Shabbos was Purim, there's also Alanissim. What do you do? This is where we get the halachos to discuss in a little bit more detail. Okay, so what I've taken, instead of taking from the actual text of the Shulchan Aruch and looking through the Torah and the Beis Yosef, etc., I've taken the text of the Alter Rebbe, and we will make our discussion based on the text of the Alter Rebbe. So the Alter Rebbe in Siman Reish Ayin Aleph Sif Tes tells us the Chachamim forbade a person to eat or drink anything, even water, once the time of Kiddush arrives until they make Kiddush. Now, this has nothing to do with Pores Mapah Umekadesh. This is on every Erev Shabbos. One is not allowed to eat or drink until they have made Kiddush. So once it reaches Ben Hashmoshes, once the sun is set, one has to make Kiddush before they are able to eat. Now, even though normally with regards to other mitzvahs, one does not have to stop. If they're eating, they can just keep going and then do the mitzvah afterwards. In this case, Chazal were worried that a person were said that you're not allowed to eat at all because Kiddush must be made as close as possible to the onset of Shabbos. It's more muhudah to make Kiddush as close to as possible to Shabbos coming in, and therefore it should be made at sunset in this case where you are sitting at a meal. And says the Alter Rebbe in the third paragraph, even if you started a meal at a time that you were allowed to, so it was before the 10th hour of the day, and you were eating, you have to stop when sunset comes. Now, he explains in the next paragraph, nonetheless, you don't actually have to stop your meal completely, which means to bench. Rather, you are able to pause your meal, make Kiddush immediately, and then conclude the meal going into the night in Friday night. Why is this done? As we explained, in order that Kiddush is said in a Mapa Seuda where the Seuda of Shabbos is after the Kiddush. And then Alter Rebbe tells us that you have to be spread the tablecloth, Pores Mapah Umekadesh. So if you were to have a look just in the Gemara and just look at the Pirush of Rashi, it would seem that Pores Mapah is that you spread it ala shulchan, which means take a tablecloth, cover the entire food on the table. The Alter Rebbe says that the main kpeda here is lechasos hapas, is to cover over the bread, the challah, as we do on a regular Shabbos. And then after Kiddush, v'achakach, you surrender, you take off the cover, kadesh tisra apas ki'ilu uva ata ala shulchan lekavod Shabbos shizkir b'kiddush, so that it appears that the bread is now being brought to the table anew in honor of Shabbos that we've just proclaimed, that we have mentioned with Shabbos coming in. Now there are different views on this. What does it mean one has to cover over the bread? So some poskim say that means only the lechem mishnah, only the two chalos that one is going to, we're going to see with regards to the bracha of amoiti, whether one makes it or not, but the two chalos, they have to be covered. Any other bread on the table does not necessarily have to be covered. However, from the Alter Rebbe and other poskim, it implies that one must cover any bread that is on the table. So if people have bread in a basket, people have bread rolls on their plates or next to their plates, they must all be covered if one is being Pores Mapah Umekadesh. And there are poskim, including the Levush, who says that no, they understand the Gemara literally as Rashi does, that Pores Mapah means ala shulchan, one must completely cover over all of the food that is on the table. Okay, so you cover it over. How do you then go about making Kiddush? So Kiddush comprises two brachas. There's the bracha of Borei Pri Hagafen, and then there's the bracha of Kiddush itself, the bracha of Mekadesh HaShabbos. And the text of the Kiddush is that the Borei Pri Hagafen comes first. The Borei Pri Hagafen, because Chazal said you must make Kiddush over a cup of wine. Presumably you haven't been drinking wine already. You make Borei Pri Hagafen over the cup of wine, you say the Kiddush, and then you drink afterwards. But when a person is Pores Mapah Umekadesh, and they've been sitting at a Seuda, for example, the Seuda's Purim, where the Rambam tells us that it's a mitzvah to drink wine, and the mitzvah of Adul Yad of drinking wine, drinking on Purim should be with wine, because the miracles all took place with wine. Therefore, one has already drunk wine during that meal, and they're not making a bracha achronim, we're not benching. So why they don't need to make another Borei Pri Hagafen when they make Kiddush, because they have already made a bracha over the wine already. So says the Alter Rebbe, there is no blessing of Hagafen said over the Kiddush wine. If you already drank wine and made a bracha over the wine at that meal. This is a ruling of the Magen Avraham. In fact, the Shulchan Aruch says that the wine that you're going to drink for Kiddush was already covered by the bracha you made over wine at the beginning of the meal. Furthermore, the Magen Avraham tells us, after you make Kiddush, if you're going to drink wine later in the meal, that too was covered by the bracha Borei Pri Hagafen that you said at the beginning of the meal before making Kiddush. And therefore, for the same reason, if a person makes Kiddush over bread, that if a person is intolerant of wine and grape juice, or a person does not have wine or grape juice, the next best option is to make Kiddush over the Halachos themselves. So if one is making Kiddush over Halachos and they have been Pores Mapah Umekadesh, they do not make a bracha hamoitzi before the Kiddush because they already have made hamoitzi at the beginning of the Seuda, and hamoitzi at the beginning of the Seuda will also cover the hamoitzi, will be in place of the hamoitzi that one would normally make over the Kiddush, and then in such a case, any hamoitzi that one eats afterwards. So that is halacha, and whilst the Tur seems to suggest there is a machlokas over this, however, the truth is that, as the Achronim explained, that there is no plukta, there is no argument at all with regards to this, that if one has drunk wine already in the Seuda, they do not make Borei Pri Hagafen when they make Kiddush at the time they are Pores Mapah Umekadesh. Now, it's an interesting discussion. What happens if you've got guests at your Purim Seuda, if it's young children or if it's ladies who have not drunk wine during the Purim Seuda, but they want to fulfill the mitzvah of drinking from the cup of Kiddush, the cup of wine? Are you allowed to then say the Borei Pri Hagafen? If you've been drinking wine at the Seuda, can you say the Borei Pri Hagafen of the Kiddush to be moitzi them? There's a Kuntras Achron from the Alter Rebbe, where the Alter Rebbe says that you are allowed to make the Borei Pri Hagafen. Normally, if a person is not obligated in a bracha, birchas hanenin over food for themselves, they cannot make it on behalf of somebody else. However, in this case, because the Borei Pri Hagafen is usually part of the Kiddush, one is allowed to make the Borei Pri Hagafen on behalf of someone else as well. But generally speaking, the halacha, as is brought down, if one drank wine already at the meal, they will not make Borei Pri Hagafen when they are Pores Mapah Umekadesh, and they will straight away, they will say, Yom HaShishi Vayichulu Shamayim Va'aretz B'chol Tzvam, and then they will start the bracha, Asher Kiddushanim B'mitzvaysa V'ratza Banu, leaving out the Borei Pri Hagafen entirely. Now that is with regards to the Borei Pri Hagafen. What about afterwards, when one then removes the covering from the table and they're now going to partake of the bread itself to be the Makom Seuda for their Shabbos meal? Do they need to make a bracha hamoitzi at that time? And here we have a machloikas rishonim. There's a machloikas of the early scholars who have a dispute as to whether one makes the bracha or not. The Razah, the Balamor, Reb Zerachi HaLevi, says that one does make the bracha hamoitzi, and he rationalizes as he says that you don't. He said that you do not make the bracha of hamoitzi, and the reason is because you're not benching. If you're not benching, that means your meal from earlier is continuing. So why would you need to make a new bracha? However, the other Rishonim, including the Rif and the Rosh, their view is that technically one does require the bracha of hamoitzi to be made afterwards. And the reason is because the Kiddush itself constitutes a hefsek, an interruption. And just as one who makes a hefsek in the meal is required to make hamoitzi when they return to their meal, so too, according to the Rosh and the Rif, after one has made Kiddush, that Kiddush creates the status of a hefsek, and then one is obligated to make the bracha of hamoitzi when they then resume. And here the Alter Rebbe writes about this in great length in Sif Yud Aleph, and he says as follows, moving to the next paragraph. Okay. So that was with regards to the bracha. But then he says as follows. However, okay, so here he brings the machlokas in Sif Yud Aleph. He brings the machlokas whether or not the Kiddush constitutes a hefsek. And that's based on the idea that we quoted at the beginning of this halachos, that once the time of Kiddush arrives, one is not allowed to eat anything until they have made Kiddush. You're not allowed to eat anything until you have made Kiddush. And since one is not allowed to eat at that point in time, the saying of Kiddush creates the status of a hefsek. Now, You might ask the question, well, what about the wine? Why then don't I need to make a bracha of Boire Priagafen, which I'm going to drink after Kiddush? So because the bracha of Boire Priagafen comes before the Kiddush, before one is then forbidden to eat, therefore one does not need to make the bracha over the yain. But the bracha of Hamoitzi comes entirely after the Kiddush. And once one is making Kiddush, one is forbidden, one is not allowed to eat, then the reciting of the Kiddush creates a hefsek, and therefore afterwards one would need to make Hamoitzi. The other opinion says that no, that in such a case the Kiddush is not considered a hefsek. So we've got a dispute amongst the Rishonim, and therefore says the Alter Rebbe as follows. There are those who argue, but when they say, this is the view of the Baal Amor, the fact that you are forbidden to eat once you make Kiddush or the time of Kiddush arrives does not constitute a hefsek. It's not considered the ending of the meal. Why? The whole reason you're being Pores Mapah Umekadesh is in order to eat more afterwards. And even now you would be eating. It's only because you're obligated to pause to make Kiddush. That's why you're not eating at this point in time. And as soon as that obstruction is taken away, meaning as soon as you have made Kiddush, you're just going back to the meal that you were in the middle of before. And therefore, according to this view, ein amiras haKiddush mafsekes, k'mo she'ein hatefila mafsekes, ve'ein tzarich lachzor ulevarach hamoitzi. So what do? We have opinions of the Rishonim, which is not conclusive. So says the Alter Rebbe, Safek brachis lahakol. We have a klal, a principle, that when it comes to making a bracha, we go like the lenient view to not make a bracha. And the reason is because one does not want to run the risk of saying a bracha she'ein tzricha, a bracha levatala. And therefore, because of this dispute, after one makes Kiddush, one would just take the chalas, the two chalas of Alecha Mishnah, and would not say anything, would not say bracha of Hamoitzi. Nonetheless, says the Alter Rebbe, Mikol Mokim Ko Baal Nefesh, a person who is a Baal Nefesh. Baal Nefesh generally refers to someone who is God-fearing, someone who wants to do the halachos in the most ideal possible way. Yesh lo lizar lechatchila, he should be careful lechatchila, shaloi lavoi lidei kach, not to come to this doubt, because on one hand you've got the Rif and the Rosh who say that you do need to make a new Hamoitzi. On the other hand, you've got the Baal Amor who says that you don't need to make the Hamoitzi. So you don't want to, Baal Nefesh doesn't want to run the risk of not making a bracha when he has to, or making a bracha when he doesn't have to. So what do? Rather, you avoid the issue altogether, and make sure to finish your meal. A Baal Nefesh, therefore, does not have Pores Mapah Umekadesh. If you want to be a Baal Nefesh, you should not be Pores Mapah Umekadesh, says the Alter Rebbe, and instead you should finish your meal on Friday before the time of Kiddush, bench for that meal, so that then when Shabbos comes in, you can make Kiddush and make the bracha of Hamoitzi without any qualms, without any worries. Now, that's based on the idea of a Baal Nefesh, and we'll come back and talk about that more, whether that's really applicable to the majority of people or not. And maybe there's some other ideas that one can do to get around this issue and still be Pores Mapah Umekadesh while still being a Baal Nefesh. So says the Alter Rebbe in Halacha Yud Gimel. Now, what about benching? So he says as follows. What happens with benching? So you made a meal that started on Friday. Again, we're not talking about Purim per se over here. You started a meal on Friday. That meal then goes into Shabbos, and you've made Kiddush in the middle, which makes the day into Shabbos. When it comes the end of the meal, you've had your kazayis, you've eaten the Purim Seuda of Shabbos. When it comes to benching, what do? So it says the Alter Rebbe in Halacha Yud Gimel that when you bench at the end of the meal, so he says you should mention Ritzei, you have to mention Shabbos. There's a mitzvah, an obligation in benching to mention the Kedushas Hayoim, and in this case it is Shabbos. And if a person was Pores Mapah Umekadesh and he finishes his meal at night, he has to mention Ritzei in Birchas Hamazon, and that is, if generally speaking, provided that his meal continued into the night, where he's eaten the kazayis of challah after Seisa Kachavim, after nightfall, then they would bench with saying Ritzei in the Birchas Hamazon. So that's when it's a normal weekday going into Shabbos. But now, in our case, when it's going from Purim, so on the weekday, there's no obligation to mention anything special about the day in benching. Shabbos is an obligation of Ritzei. But when one goes from a day which itself is a unique day, such as Rosh Chodesh into Shabbos, or the meal of Purim going into Shabbos, where on Purim one says Ala Nisim, and on Shabbos one says Ritzei, what does one do in such an instance where the meal continues into, the Purim meal continues, your Pores Mapah, and goes into Shabbos? So for this, we need to look early in the Shulchan Aruch to Siman Kuf Pei Zayin, where the Alter Rebbe discusses the laws of benching and discusses the laws of mentioning the Kedushas Hayom in the benching itself. So in Siman Kuf Pei Zayin, the Alter Rebbe says as follows: if a person was eating a meal on Shabbos, and their meals, the Shalosh Shudos on Shabbos afternoon continues into after Shabbos, even a number of hours into the night, when you bench at the end of the meal, you still say Ritzei. Why? We go after the beginning of the meal. The meal began on Shabbos afternoon. Therefore, when you bench, even if it's late at night on Motzei Shabbos, you are obligated to mention Ritzei, to mention Shabbos in the benching. Says the Alter Rebbe, put Shabbos out of the picture. So too on a regular Rosh Chodesh, on a regular Chanukah or Purim, which needs either Yala V'Yovav or Ala Nisim, then when one's having a meal on Purim, on a regular year, as we do, that meal will go into the night. One will mention Yalavi, one would mention Ala Nisim at night as well, because we go after the Tchilas Hasuda. But then he says, V'yesh Oimim, and this is a Chuvas Haramah. The Chuvas Haramah says that on Rosh Chodesh, Chanukah or Purim, since there is no mitzvah of Tosefes Chol Ala Kodesh, one does not mention them after the day has passed. What does that mean? So on Shabbos, there is a mitzvah of Tosefes Shabbos to add to Shabbos before and afterwards, same on Yom Tov as well. And therefore, says the Ramah, that is why when one has their meal going into Motzei Shabbos, one would still say Ritzei on Motzei Shabbos, because one is allowed to continue Shabbos, and one should continue Shabbos into Motzei Shabbos. But when it comes to Rosh Chodesh, Chanukah, Purim, where there is no obligation to continue the day, in fact, there is no Tosefes Mechol Al HaKodesh, therefore, the Ramah says that then we don't say we go after the Tchilas Hasuda. If your meal concludes after Dak, one would not say Yala V'Yov on Rosh Chodesh or Ala Nisim on Chanukah Purim. Says the Alter Rebbe, Be'ein Noegin Kain. We don't follow that view, and rather we say as long as the beginning of the meal was on the day, even if you conclude at night, one still mentions Yala V'Yov or Ala Nisim for Chanukah Purim. That is all when one is going into a weekday. What happens though if your meal on Rosh Chodesh or Purim or Chanukah goes into Shabbos? Says the Alter Rebbe, or even a weekday meal. One is having a meal on a regular Erev Shabbos or an Erev Rosh Chodesh, and the meal goes into the night. Then you have to mention Shabbos, Shabbos, or Rosh Chodesh. If you ate a kazayis after nightfall, after it was dark, after it was already Shabbos, after it was already Rosh Chodesh, even though we would say you have to go after the Tchilas HaSeuda, and that was a regular weekday where you didn't have to mention Shabbos or Rosh Chodesh. Nonetheless, once you eat the kazayis after nightfall, you now have the obligation to mention Shabbos because it's now Shabbos. And similarly, if you're eating a meal on Erev Chanukah Purim that went into Chanukah Purim, then one has a kazayis after nightfall. One is obligated to eat to say Ala Nisim in benching. Then he says, this is the opinion of the Taz, even if a person did not eat a kazayis after it became dark, nonetheless, even then you still have to mention, if you went into Shabbos, you went into Chanukah, you went into Purim, you still need to bench with Ritzei or Yala V'Yavoy or Ala Nisim B'Chanukah or Purim. Similarly, now we get more towards our case. If one was having a Sudas Shabbos or a Rosh Chodesh or Chanukah Purim meal that goes into the night, even if you finish your meal, but the benching got delayed till night, right? One would also. Now he says we follow the Svara Rishona, and that is that one is only obligated to mention Rosh Chodesh or Chanukah Purim if they ate a kazayis once it became dark. And all of this, however, is if one did not if a person daven Ma'ariv, so then one daven Ma'ariv, that already makes it into a new day, and then we can't say you go after Halachos Seuda. So for example, if one was eating the Shalosh Shudos on Shabbos afternoon, Well, that's a bit different. One was eating on Rosh Chodesh, and one's meal went into Motzei Rosh Chodesh, one stopped to daven Ma'ariv. Then we don't say you go after the beginning of the meal and say Ya'aleh V'Yavo when you bench at night, because once you've davened Ma'ariv, it would be a tarti desasri, it would be self-contradictory. Because by davening Ma'ariv, you're saying it's night already, which means it's no longer Rosh Chodesh, or it's no longer Chanukah, it's no longer Purim. How can you then go and say Ya'aleh V'Yavo or say Al Hanisim? Nonetheless, if one did not daven Ma'ariv, and Sunday is Rosh Chodesh, so you're eating the Shudas on Shabbos afternoon, that goes into Motzei Shabbos, this is Rosh Chodesh, Maskir Shel Shabbos V'gam Shel Rosh Chodesh. So now that meal, because you started the meal on Shabbos, you have to say Ritzei. But because that meal is going into the night and you eat a kazayis after nightfall, which is Rosh Chodesh, you have to say Ya'aleh V'Yavo. The Ein Kan Stira, says the Alter Rebbe, it's not a paradox, it's not contradictory. Why? Because you are mentioning Shabbos and only after Rosh Chodesh. The Seder in benching is Ritzei, comes before Ya'aleh V'Yavo. So in this case, when Motzei Shabbos is Rosh Chodesh, so the Ritzei for Shabbos comes before the Ya'aleh V'Yavo of Motzei Shabbos, which is Rosh Chodesh, and therefore it is not going to be seen as a contradiction. Now, what about if it's the other way around? The implication from this Alter Rebbe would be that if it's the other way around, that one was eating on Friday, which is Rosh Chodesh, and that meal continues into Shabbos, your Pores Mapah Umekadesh, and you eat a kazayis after nightfall on Shabbos. In such a case, if you were to say Ya'aleh V'Yavo for Friday Rosh Chodesh and Ritzei for Shabbos, in that order, it would seemingly be contradictory, and therefore, based on that, it would be seeming from the Alter Rebbe that one would not mention Ya'aleh V'Yavo in such a case, or one would not mention Ritzei. In that case, one would not say both. Nonetheless, there is a letter from the Rebbe in Igros Kodesh, and the letter from the Igros Kodesh in Chelek Yudala, the Alter Rebbe says, based on a Hoirah from the Frierdiker Rebbe, that in such a case, even when Erev Shabbos is Yom Tov, or Erev Shabbos would be Rosh Chodesh, one still says Ya'aleh V'Yavo and Ritzei, even though the order seems contradictory. And that's the halacha, what we do. In fact, the Frierdiker Rebbe said that you say Ritzei and Ya'aleh V'Yavo in the regular order, and the malachim, the angels who take up our tefillos to Hashem, they will work out how to rearrange the order in the proper way. Okay, so now how does this apply with regards to Purim, with regards to being Pores Mapah Umekadesh? Okay, so we mentioned already as follows: if one starts the meal on Friday afternoon, one can be Pores Mapah Umekadesh. Now, one of the discussions which is had is, we said before that on Erev Shabbos, one ideally should make their meal before the Shah Asiris. That's according to the Maril, according to the Alter Rebbe, and according to the Rama, must be Shachris. And that is because one should not be so full, one should come into Shabbos with an appetite. So the question is Pores Mapah Umekadesh, if I'm only going to start my meal at 6 o'clock in the afternoon, my Purim Seuda, am I doing something wrong? Am I doing something wrong by not starting before the Shah Asiris? So there are those who say that the whole Kpeda of starting before Shah Asiris in order to have an appetite is only if you're having a meal and you're going to end the meal before Shabbos and then have a separate meal when Shabbos comes in. Because then we say that one gets full and one won't have an appetite for when Shabbos comes in. However, if one is sitting at the Seuda and it's going to continue into Shabbos itself, in such a case, one is constantly eating, and so to speak, their throat, their stomach is open to eat more and more and more. And on the contrary, one will still have an appetite for the Shabbos meal, and therefore, accordingly, even l'chatchila, if one is being Pores Mapah Umekadesh, one can start the meal later. There is a deal from the Alter Rebbe in the laws of the Pesach Seder in Tafresh Ayin Aleph, which seems to suggest that even when one would be Pores Mapah Umekadesh, or even if one's meal would continue from Erev Shabbos into Shabbos, one should still only make sure to start the meal before the Shah Asiris, before the 10th hour of the day, and therefore that would be preferable, that would be l'chatchila, that would be ideal. Okay, so then you would come to Pores Mapah, you would come at the time when Shkia comes in. Now, practically at that point in time, 18 minutes before Shkia, which is the Zman of Lichtzen, all of the ladies would have to light candles. And the ladies would have to light candles and be Mekabel Shabbos through the lighting of candles, because to light 18 minutes beforehand is a minig of the Kehillah to light at that time. Then comes the time of Shkia at sunset. If you want, you could be Pores Mapah Umekadesh already from Plaga Mincha. but at least the Chol HaPachos at the time of Shkia, you would take a tablecloth, and according to the Alter Rebbe, just to cover all of the bread on the table, you would bring 2 loaves of bread, which is the Lechem Mishnah. Again, the Alter Rebbe doesn't mention that, the Shulchan Aruch doesn't mention that, but Pashtus, there's an obligation of being Boitzeya on Lechem Mishnah on Shabbos. One would bring the Lechem Mishnah for Shabbos. One would then say the Shalom Aleichem and Eishes Chayil. Again, it's not mentioned in the Shulchan Aruch or the Alter Rebbe, but presumably that is what one would do. And then one would make Kiddush with the Chalas covered, with all of the bread covered on the table. And in that case, if one was already drinking wine at the Seuda, one would say Kiddush without the bracha of Boirei Pri Agafa. They would say Yom HaShishi and go into the bracha of Mekadesh HaShabbos. Unless, of course, one did not drink wine, or if one has guests who are going to drink from the Kiddush and they have not made the bracha of Hagafen themselves or drank wine during the meal earlier. After one has made Kiddush, one does not wash Netilas Yadayim, again, because one's already in the middle of the meal. You've already washed at the beginning of the meal, so there is no Netilas Yadayim. And one would then take the 2 chalas there to be Boitzeya on the Lechem Mishnah. Because of the doubt, because of the argument of the Rishonim, one would not say the bracha of Hamoitzi at all. And one would then cut the challah and to eat the kazayis of challah to be yotze Kiddush b'makom Seuda. And if one wants to be able to bench with Ritzei, one would need to have the kazayis also after Tzeisa Kachavim as well. Now, we mentioned that according to Alter Rebbe, because of this dispute, a Baal Nefesh should not be Pores Mapah Umekadesh. So is there any Eitzah to be Pores Mapah Umekadesh and still be a Baal Nefesh? So to make Kiddush on the challah, that's not ideal, because a Baal Nefesh, you should make Kiddush on wine. But I thought that one Eitzah would be as possible as well. That if one invites for the Shabbos meal guests who had the Purim Seuda early in the day. So you know someone who's making the Purim Seuda in the afternoon or in the morning, and they'll have their Purim Seuda, they'll bench. You invite them to come at Shkia time and join you for your Shabbos meal. So when they join you, that guest has a chiyuv to make hamoitzi because they're starting their meal anew. And they could be moitzi everybody with the hamoitzi, and one could have in mind to be yoter with them if one is obligated to have the hamoitzi. There are other eitzes which Chabad Rabbanim have discussed as well, but I think that would be, if it's possible to do, the most effective and the most practical way to go about it. Okay, so one should eat the kazayis or chabetza afterwards to be yotze Kiddush b'makom Seuda, or to have more wine, or to have mazonis. And for benching, if one wants to say Ritzei, one would actually have to eat also kazayis after Tzeis HaKoichavim. Okay, so then one would continue their meal, and when they're finished, it would come time for benching. So in this scenario, we mentioned that according to the letter of the Rebbe, one would say, yeah, if it was Rosh Chodesh going into Shabbos, one would say Ya'aleh v'Yavo and Ritzei, even though the order is out of whack. When it comes to Al Hanisim of Purim, anyway, it's different because Al Hanisim is said earlier in the benching than Ritzei. So one would say, again, there's a machloikas about this. In fact, whether one says Ritzei or when one would say Al Hanisim in benching or not. In the Piskei Tshuvos, he brings a machloikas what exactly one should do. He says one should say Ritzei as regular and say the Al Hanisim in the Harachamans. When one says the Harachamans, where we normally say Harachaman Yachid Leinu Liyom Shekol Shabbos, one would say Harachaman Yaseh Lanu Nisim. One would say Harachaman there and then go into the text of Al Hanisim. However, that's the ruling of the Mishnah Brura, and the Ketzois Shulchan actually says that might be preferable. We'll come back to that in a moment. However, there are those, and that seems to be practically the mice of what people would do, is you say Al Hanisim in the regular order, and that is based on a Meiri. The Meiri in Ksubas, the Meiri was one of the Rishonim, and the Meiri says that when such a kfiyus happened, that when such a kfiyus would happen, the Purim would fall out on Friday. The custom would be that they would be Pores Mapah Umekadesh, and they would bench with both Al Hanisim and they would bench with Ritzei as well. So the Meiri, being a Rishon, is also someone who could rely on as well. Further is that the 15th of Adar, whilst we don't celebrate that, but as far as it's Shushan Purim as well, and therefore one would be able to say Al Hanisim as a hemshech of their Seuda as well. Now the Ketzois HaShulchan in Sim Mem Zayin writes that he says as follows. He says we should, even though we don't paskin like the Magen Avram, that it would be contradictory to say both Alanisim or Yala v'Yavoy and to say Ritzei, even though we don't paskin that way. Nonetheless, there's a difference. We know that when it comes to Rosh Chodesh, we saw the Alter Rebbe paskins like the Taz. The one would say if Friday was Rosh Chodesh, if Sunday was Rosh Chodesh, and the meal went from Motzei Shabbos into Sunday, one would say both Ritzei and Yale v'Yavoy. Nonetheless, in this case, it's a little bit different. Why is it a little bit different? So he says as follows. First of all, Yale v'Yavoy on Yom Tov and Rosh Chodesh, as with Ritzei on Shabbos, is a chiyuv gomer. You have to mention the day in benching. When it comes to Alanisim, both Chanukah Purim, in the meal, it is only a minhag that we do. And therefore, since it is only a minhag, in that case, says Shulchan, one, it is better not to say Alanisim when one is Pores Mapah and benching after nightfall, especially because we also have the view of the Ramah that we quoted in the Tshuva that when any day which does not have Tosefes, you don't have to add on to it, one would not bench after mention in benching once the day has passed by. And therefore, according to Ktosei Shulchan, it would be better either not to say Alanisim at all or to say it in the Harachmans. But again, Lamaisa, what people do is they would, when they Pores Mapah, would bench with both Al Hanisim and they would do also Ritzei, like the view of the Meiri. After one is then finished, one then needs to daven Ma'ariv. Now, normally one is not allowed to eat before davening Ma'ariv. However, because one is in their Seuda that they started Beheter at a time which was permissible to do so, and especially when one is eating with company with other people and will only daven Ma'ariv at the end, there is no problem. So after one is finished benching, they would then daven Kabbalah Shabbos and Ma'ariv. In fact, there are those who suggest that Kabbalah Shabbos could be davened earlier. Some people like to daven Kabbalah Shabbos close to the coming in of Shabbos. That's what Kabbalah Shabbos is about. But certainly one would daven Ma'ariv at that time with Krishma, etc. at that time. If, however, one did daven Ma'ariv in the middle, and some shuls might do this, is when they stop to make Kiddush, they'll daven Kabbalah Shabbos Ma'ariv and then make Kiddush. In that case, where you've daven Ma'ariv, that is clearly a hefsek, as we saw in the Shulchan Aruch, and then one would not say Alanisim in benching, one would only mention the Ritzei of Shabbos as, would say Shabbos as well. Okay, and again, important to remember to eat a kazayis of hamoitzi after tzeisa kachavim. Okay, so that's the basics in terms of the halachos and the background of Pores Mapah Umekadesh. I know we're getting short on time, so quickly just to run through with regards to the Rabbeim as well. So we know it's Yedua that the Rabbeim themselves were not noyeg themselves to be Pores Mapah Umekadesh. The Rabbeim, the Frierdiker Rebbe, the Rebbe Rashab, and the Rebbe themselves would not be Pores Mapah Umekadesh. Nonetheless, when you would have Yom Tov, for example, Rosh Hashanah, Simchas Torah would fall Thursday, Friday, going into Shabbos. So it was customary to have a Fabrengen on the second day of Yom Tov in the afternoon. And when it goes into Shabbos, whilst the Rabbeim themselves were not Pores Mapah Umekadesh, they allowed, and our Rebbe in fact would request that someone from amongst the Olam at the Fabrengen should be Pores Mapah Umekadesh and be moitzi the oilam with Kiddush so that they can continue to fabreng and they can continue to say l'chaim at the Yom Tov fabrengen going into Shabbos. And that's how it was throughout all the years. Now, interesting, okay, we'll come back if we have time to the Frierdiker Rebbe. But that's how it was. For example, Simchas Torah Tavshin Yud Zayin, so the Rebbe spoke about being Pores Mapah Umekadesh alayayin, and even though the Rabbeim did not do this, because of Tamim Yuduim, their own reasons. Now, what were their own reasons? So the Kaf HaChaim brings that according to Kabbalah, based on the Arizal, one should not be Pores Mapah Umekadesh. And the reason is that on Shabbos, there is a Seder of Aliyah So'elamas. The worlds become elevated to higher and higher levels. And that Aliyah follows various steps. And those steps go through the davening, the various parts of the Kabbalah Shabbos, from Kabbalah Shabbos, the Chadoidi, etc., Baruch Hu, moving forward. And in the Seder of the Aliyahs of Shabbos, the davening must come before the Seuda Shabbos, before the Kiddush and the meal of Shabbos. And therefore, if one were to be Pores Mapah Umekadesh and say Kiddush and the Seuda Shabbos before davening Ma'ariv, one is then circumventing, one is playing around with the order of the Aliyahs of Shabbos. And for that reason, the Rebbeim didn't do it themselves. Nonetheless, with regards to the Tzibur, the Chassidim, they would be Pores Mapah Umekadesh. One person would be Moitzi everyone, so they could keep fabrenging. And this is how it was throughout the years by the Rebbe until the year Tavshin Mem Dalet. The year Tavshin Mem Dalet, So the Rebbe said that they should announce that at the time when Shkia will come, that no one should eat, they should be Pores Mapah, someone would be Pores Mapah Umekadesh. And the Rebbe gave instruct they should announce all the details of the halachos, how to go about being Pores Mapah Umekadesh, as well as with regards to benching, with regards to saying Ritzei and Yala v'Yavoy in benching, presumably the idea of having the kazais after night. Now the Rebbe would lead the benching because the Rebbe would also give Kois Shel Bracha afterwards. And even though the Rebbe was not Pores Mapah Umekadesh himself, nonetheless, the Rebbe said Harachman would say the Harachman of Shabbos would say the Harachman would not say the Shabbos Ritzei, but in Harachman would mention the Harachman of Shabbos. Anyway, whatever happened there, I'm not exactly sure, but it's referred to as the bilbul. That the Gabbai who made the announcement made a mistake in giving over the halachas, and therefore, as a result of that, in the subsequent Fabrengen on Simchas Torah, which also was on a Friday going into Shabbos, the Rebbe said they will no longer be Pores Mapah Umekadesh because of the bilbulim that happened in the last time on Rosh Hashanah. And the Rebbe spoke about it again on Shabbos Bereshis and Tavshim Mem Daled as well. Now, that seemed to be, if we were to just look at that Fabring in isolation, it doesn't necessarily mean that in Chabad we're not Pores Mapah Umekadesh. It seems that there was a bilbul, they messed up at that time because there was a big olam and people were confused. But if a person, a Rav, is achrai on their kehillah, maybe that's different indeed. There are some Rabbanim in Eretz Yisrael, Chabad Rabbanim said one could be Pores Mapah Umekadesh if it's under rabbinic supervision, which I would assume mean they've got clear step-by-step guidelines. But in Tavshin Mem Ches, the Rebbe was again the same kriyas. The Simchas Torah was Thursday, Friday, going into Shabbos. And at the Fabrengen, the Rebbe said that they should announce that when it comes Shkia, people should stop eating, should no longer say L'chaim. And since we are not going to be Pores Mapah Umekadesh, they should therefore announce that that all the laws, the one is not allowed to eat anymore. And then the Rebbe said that since we're not Pores Mapah Umekadesh, la'acharei shepasku linoi kain b'Chabad. After we have stopped observing this, doing this in Chabad, which seems to be a very emphatic statement, that we do not do this in Chabad anymore. We do Pores Mapah Umekadesh. Therefore, one should hurry up and say L'chaim before the Shkia. And indeed, after that in Tavshin and Aleph was the same Kriyos, the Rebbe then, the Fabrengen, changed from being on Friday afternoon to becoming Shabbos afternoon instead. Now, what is the basis of this? So I was thinking to myself, there's one of two possibilities. Either the Rebbe, in Mem Daled, the Rebbe was worried about the bilbul of the Seder. Is that the reason why in Tavshin Mem Ches we don't do it in Lubavitch anymore? Because we're worried about the bilbul of Seder? Because for that, there's a very simple eitzah. A Rav writes clear step-by-step guidelines. Everyone takes out the paper and follows what it says there. So maybe I was thinking that the Rebbe is saying that it's now time for the Chassidim to follow the Hanhaga of the Rabbeim. Throughout all the years, the Rabbeim themselves were not Pores Mapah Umekadesh. In fact, in the year Tov Reish Pei, which is the Histalkus of the Rebbe Rashab, the Rebbe Rashab was Pores Mapah Umekadesh on Rosh Hashanah. There's a whole story there which the Friedrich Rebbe tells in Tavshin Daled. The Friedrich Rebbe was devastated, was very upset by it. But the Rebbe Landau Paskin, the Rebbe Rashab Shud, and gave wine, he made Kiddush, was Pores Mapah Umekadesh. But the Rebbeim Bichlal were not. Why? Because in Yonim Alpi Kabbalah, which is Shaykh to Rebbeim. And perhaps what the Rebbe is saying is that now we are being elevated, perhaps as we're coming to Yemoisa Mashiach, that it's now appropriate that all Chassidim should follow the practice of the Rebbe. And if that is indeed the case, then on that basis, Chabad Chassidim would not be Pores Mapah Umekadesh. Nonetheless, I did mention that Chabad Rabbanim in Eretz Yisrael who say that in such a Kiddush of Purim, one can be Pores Mapah Umekadesh. In Eretz Yisrael, when you'd have the Seudas Mashiach going into Shabbos as well, that Rabbanim say you could be Pores Mapah Umekadesh. The bottom line is one should ask their own personal Rav or Mashpia or both as to whether it's appropriate to be Pores Mapah Umekadesh for the Purim Seuda. And if so, how to go about it with clear step-by-step instructions, which one can find very accessibly about what one needs to do. Just interesting, the Rebbe said in that year of Tavshim Mem Daled, I believe, that with regards to saying the Ritzei, when the Rebbe benched, the Rebbe himself did not
was not Pores Mapah Umekadesh, and therefore did not eat after Tzeisa Kachavim, but the Rebbe was benching on behalf of everybody, of everybody else. So he explained that in Rosh Hashanah, because some of the Kehillah were Pores Mapah Umekadesh, and they were obligated, according to all opinions, to mention Ritzei Shabbos in their benching. However, there were also those, the Rebbe is referring to himself, who were not Pores Mapah Umekadesh, and therefore they don't have to mention. Therefore, the one who is benching on the koy, since he's like the shliach tzibur being moitzi everybody else, even though he himself was not Pores Mapah Umekadesh, therefore it's not kedai to leave it out all together. And therefore, because there's a svara that he should also mention it, therefore he could say it in the harachmans. And the Rebbe said, of course, when one says that harachman, one doesn't lose out, because that harachman we say harachman ya'akelenu liyom shekol Shabbos. It's a tefillah bakasha for the geula. May Hashem bring us to the yom shekol Shabbos, the day which is all Shabbos. And a tefillah for the geula is always helpful. So the Ezras Hashem, whether one is going to be benching at the end of the Purim Seuda on Friday night, being Pores Mapah Umekadesh, or one will do like the Ramah, like the Alter Rebbe says, to make the Seuda early in the day and have their Shabbos meal later. When we say those words, Harachmon hu yanched leinu liyom shekol Shabbos u'menucha l'chaya olamim, may Hashem answer those tefillahs even beforehand and bring us to the Yom Shekol Shabbos, the day which is all Shabbos, which is of course the Yom Mashiach, which should happen take of Umiyad Mamish. Okay, if there are any questions,